I will introduce our next honorary doctor, who is Ortwin Renn from Germany. I will do the introduction in Swedish, and I have talked with Ortwin about that. Ortwin Renn är professor i teknikbedömning och miljösociologi. Tillika vetenskaplig chef för IASS, Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Tyskland. Professor Renns huvudsakliga forskning vid IASS fokuserar på vilket sätt systemiska risker utgör ett hot för hållbar utveckling. Han har en betydande roll i utvecklingen av risk- och krisforskning och är allmänt ansedd som den främsta forskaren inom området i Europa idag. Ortwin Renn är en viktig samverkanspartner inom den pågående forskningen vid risk- och krisforskningscentret RCR, och utnämningen innebär att Mittuniversitetet tar ytterligare ett steg för att etablera sig på den internationella arenan inom området risk- och krisforskning. So very welcome. The floor is yours.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm very delighted to be here this afternoon, and I feel very honored to be getting one of the honorary doctorates here at Mittuniversitet. And I would like to share with you some of my basic work on risk and risk governance. And what I would like to stress today is the dominance or the new challenge of polycrisis. And when we talk about polycrisis, we mean that there are different crises happening at the same time. They do overlap. And we can see it right now. We are right in the middle of a climate crisis. We are in the middle of a war between Ukraine and Russia. We are facing a food crisis at the same time as a part of the war, and we are just getting over a pandemic which still have caused a lot of repercussions on our society. So what is very typical for modern societies is not that we have one crisis after another, but that we are facing multiple crises interacting with each other. And there are basically two strategies or two mechanisms that we have to look at. One is called contagion, that one crisis is contagious towards the other one, and the other one is cascading, that a crisis has secondary and tertiary impacts that will have then also consequences for the original system. We don't have a very good taxonomy, and we also have not very good theoretical concepts dealing with polycrisis. And therefore, we need to have a new perspective, which we have framed systemic perspective. And on multiple crises, so we are talking about potential losses, which is a breakdown of a system's functionality, so that a whole system really breaks apart, so that it's not functional anymore, so that's the worst thing that can happen. They can infect other systems. This is a contagious element. We have the likelihood of risk cascades that can be within a system, let's say within an economic system, but also between different systems. So it may start as a crisis in a health part, and then it relates to the economic part, then maybe to the psychological sphere, and then to the political. And that would be typical for a pandemic. They're very often related to wicked problems and governance. If we want to govern this in a very effective way, we need to find very integrated and target-oriented policy packages. Now, for doing so, what we really do need is an analytic risk framework that helps us to study polycrisis. And the main challenge is if everything is interconnected, then it's very difficult to have a concept or a theory or some kind of a framework that helps us to deal with it, because it needs to be simple. And so what we've tried to do is to say, basically, when we're talking about risk, and specifically multiple risks, there are two main components that we deal with. Number one is the risk agent, and the number one is the risk-absorbing system. A risk agent is the carrier of the destructive force that stresses a system. So that's what an agent is in this specific nomenclature. And so we are only a very limited amount of risk agents. And that's the kind of virtue of this approach, that we are not talking about millions of risk causes, millions of interconnecting variables. We're talking basically about 5 agents. That's all. And these 5 agents are 3 physical agents. One is energy, substance, and biota. Those are 3 physical ones. Energy, of course, in all its form, kinetic energy, explosion, X-rays or whatsoever, substance, basically chemicals, and biota, we just, of course, have experienced the biota of viruses. But in addition, we have social agents, and the 2 major ones are power and information. And within power, we also include violence, and within information, we include money. And the good thing about this perspective is that if we look just at those agents, we can basically model all polycrises, because it's always a connection between energy, substance, biota, power, and information. And maybe one starts, let's say, as a pandemic, then we're talking about biota. That could lead us to information deficits, would lead people to do maybe some wrong things. It maybe take substances that are not very valid, then they get sick. They may have impacts on the economy that may release extra energy, and that could lead to a loss of money, and then we may have social unrest in the end. So we can basically use all these 5 in terms of permutating them, and then we can also create very good scenarios. And then, of course, these agents have an impact on the risk-absorbing system, which means we have all kinds of targets, or we call them systems because they're not just one target like a human body or an ecosystem, but they're also all intertwined. And if we look specifically at the risk agent, then we're dealing with what we call probabilistic risk assessment. That is where we look at, how probable is it that that agent actually will be exposed, or that a risk system will be exposed to a risk agent. Or if we don't know the agents very well, or how their composition is going to be, then we are looking at the vulnerability of the risk-absorbing system, how robust, how resilient is that system, regardless what kind of stressors will occur. So this is a kind of the conceptual framework with what we're trying to work in order to study these kind of polycrisis developments. Now, there are specific properties of these polycrises, which makes it especially complicated to deal with them. I talked already about that they are highly complex, that they're all interconnected. They are characterized by stochastic relationships. They're normally nonlinear, those are spans, because they're interconnected. And very often they have tipping points or tipping areas. The more problematic in terms of governance is that they are cross-sectoral and very often transboundary in terms of the cascades that follow from them. And these transboundary effects can be geographic, from Sweden to Norway, whatever, to UK. They can be sectoral, from the economic sector to the financial sector, the financial sector to the social sector, to the political sector, and then maybe back to the health sector again. And they may be political. And it leads to major ambiguities in interpretation and management, something I know that a lot of the scholars here at Mittuniversitet University are working on, the issue of ambiguities. Anna and Susanna and others have published quite a bit on that specific topic. There are a couple of challenges that go along with it. The first major challenge is that if we talk about this, even if we have this simple model of agents and risk-absorbing systems, we may have limits of quantification and cause-effect assessments because things are all intertwined. The second point is more theoretical but very, very relevant. The more systems are interconnected, the more unlikely effects may occur that have an impact on the performance of the system. Or to put it in kind of numerical terms, there are at least 1 million events with a probability of 1 over a million that could have an impact on that. So that one of these very unlikely events, we call them black swans, is happening, is extremely likely. Which one we don't know. And that makes it very interesting in terms of uncertainty assessment. We have normally a plurality of knowledge claims and assessments. There are a lot of counterintuitive implications if things are complex, because intuition or plausibility means something is close in time or space. That's how we intuitively think about risk. If something is remote in time and space, it doesn't sound right to us that that is actually a causal connection. If we have tipping points, trial and error is not a good learning method, because we always get positive feedback until it's too late, and then it's too late. So we need to anticipate the tipping point, and that's specifically true for climate change, for example. And statistically, if we talk about these systemic risks, we have a very bad record for risk reduction worldwide. I give you here a few examples that we have on these kind of polycrisis candidates or systemic risks. The intensity of human intervention into the natural environment, climate, biodiversity, pollution, well, you name it. The interconnectivity of technologies, a very important element, cybersecurity, energy blackouts, and I can give you more examples there. There is thirdly the interaction between natural hazards and human habitats, earthquakes, floods, and impacts on built structures. Just think about Fukushima. He had the flood, and that had an impact on the emergency electricity system in Fukushima, and that then was leading to a meltdown of the reactor. And lastly, and not least, I think it's extremely important, the social side effects of modernization and globalization. We see it right now in the war. Part of that is definitely true to this anti-globalization and anti-modernization effort, and that could lead to health threats like pandemic, social equity, or better, inequities, populism, war, distrust in governments. All of that are crises or risks that we need to deal with. Those are the examples of what I was meaning. Now, what are the requirements for risk and risk governance? The first kind of principal strategy is if you have a lot of agents interacting, it doesn't make much sense to focus on one agent alone. But that has been the recipe for risk management for the last 150 years. So we were really focusing, let's say, on energy release, or we were relating on toxic substances, or we were relating to bacteria. Now we need to think about them in connection. And that means basically we look at the risk-absorbing system and make sure that those systems are resilient, that they can deal with multiple stresses at the same time. That normally we do with reverse stress tests. That we start out with vulnerabilities and then assess potential stressors that could have an impact on that vulnerability. Then we have the Blacksmith Scenarios. I talked about this. It's very good. We've done this, for example, for blackout and electricity. We built 20 very unlikely scenarios and then had a stress test for our energy systems. Does it work or doesn't it work? And if a system survives 20 very unlikely scenarios, then you can be pretty sure that it will also survive the 21st one that will happen and that you did not model. So we are not saying we model the right scenario, probably not. But we can test the system, how resilient it is. And lastly, I think, which is extremely important, is include stakeholders into the analysis, not only because it's democratically, normatively a good thing to do, but also because we need the kind of experiential knowledge that is important in order to deal with polycrisis that we cannot do analytically. So there are limits of analytical thought where we need the kind of experience of the life world that helps us basically to also manage these kind of risks in a better form. I will drop this one because I only have a little bit of time left. What I would like to also stress in this vein of inclusion of stakeholders into the process. So what we advocate is what we call the analytic deliberative approach. This is actually coined by the US Academy of Science, and it's saying it's a combination of the characteristics of an analytic component, where we deal with evidence, but we know that there's a plurality of evidence, that we do joint fact-finding, that we need multi-criteria assessment to see the various dimensions of impacts from polycrisis, and that we be very transparent about trade-offs, something that we did not do very well in the pandemic. But then as a part, or a second part, which is just as important, is a deliberative component, which is not based on evidence, but on good arguments, on how to make trade-offs, on how to do justice to different populations, and how to make sure that we actually consider secondary and tertiary impacts. And the key variables here are my solutions fair? Are they serving the common good? Do we increase resilience? And is it economically viable? And the crucial factor here is inclusiveness and consensus on the rules, how to make decisions. That's the kind of transparency that's necessary for people to buy into the solution. So let me come to my conclusions. We have a whole set of new polycrises that come up, and my assumption is that we will experience more polycrises in the future. It's not just the one that we are dealing with right now. And these polycrises are highly complex. They're cross-sectoral and cross-boundary. They have amplification and cascading effects that we need to deal with. They're stochastic in their relationships, nonlinear, often with tipping points, and there's a lack of attendance to the systemic risks that lie behind the polycrisis. So we need new management strategies, and these new management strategies first should highlight more the resilience of the system than the probability of the agent, and should be really focused on the risk-absorbing system, how well it is equipped to cope with multiple stressors. We need to look at a variety of unlikely stress scenarios with specific combinations, and we should focus on the integration of multiple stakeholders and public participation as a means to bring in the experiential and tacit knowledge of the people who are affected with it, because that is a very important addition to the analytic knowledge that science can bring. I would like to end with a quote by Bertrand Russell. He said, "What man desires is not knowledge, but certainty." And I would say, sure, but we won't have it. Policymakers cannot produce certainty, but they can help people to develop coping mechanisms to deal prudently with the necessary uncertainty that is required for societies to progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any questions or comments?
Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. I was just wondering a bit if you could elaborate a bit on time and temporality, which to me seems quite crucial as well in this. Like many of these effects or these scenarios that you mentioned, they work according to different temporal registers, which also makes it harder, right? So if you could just say a bit on time and temporality in relation to this kind of strategy.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. That's a very important question. And I'm not saying that I have a real good answer to this, because very often what we can see is when we talked about this cascading effects, because that's something where time is very crucial. And what we can see when we look retrospectively at some of these crises, that depending on how you deal, let's say, with the secondary impacts, so tertiary impacts will differ quite a bit. And then you get, of course, such a portfolio of different scenarios that you cannot handle anymore. And one of the things that we try to do was, what I said, is to come up with unlikely scenario, so that we say, okay, those secondary impacts, maybe the worst thing that can happen is here, then we get to the tertiary and the quaternary and so on, and then people don't understand it and don't respond, and then we get other ones, and to see, you know, where are the most vulnerable parts that we need to address in order to make sure that even if things go in the wrong direction, we can still deal with it. And of course, we cannot, of course, prepare all the systems to deal with whatever can happen, but we can make it a little bit more robust.
Thank you very much for the lecture. It's wonderful to have you here. I was just thinking that this system perspective works very well in a perfect world where all the systems agree and everybody is in consensus. But we work in these, especially the wicked problems, we work on a global scale with very different political systems, with some problematic countries, etc. So I was thinking if you can bake that in, those kinds of sort of political uncertainties, I guess.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I think one of the reasons that I included the social agents, which is information and power. Now, of course, that is, again, I said, is extremely condensed. But it does help us to say, well, if we have very autocratic systems, that has its impact on both, on the flow of information and on the distribution of power. And that helps us in a sense to say, are these kind of combinations helpful or not helpful to deal with a specific crisis, and what are the kind of risks that we face if we do one or the other. I think one of the most crucial questions right now in the world is, are we confident that democratic systems are better suited to deal with planetary boundaries and the polycrisis that we face? That, I think, is one of the central questions. And I know that a lot of autocratic systems believe, no, we are doing much better. So we can focus on power and information. And the Chinese government is saying, well, we're much better than you are. And I think one of the things that we try to do also as, people who, would like to see non-autocratic systems to succeed, to find good governance tools that are inclusive but at the same time effective. And that, I think, is the challenge.
Are there any examples of how these poly-crises have been foreseen and been able to cope with? So are there historical events that have been disasters that have been avoided because
of this? A little louder, I could not understand you, sorry.
Okay, I'll try it. Do you hear me now?
Yeah, I think now it's better. Yeah.
Well, are there any examples of how you have been able to foresee and manage these potential crises then in those cases, so there is some success to manage problems?
Yeah, well, I think it's totally clear. I mean, we don't have a crystal ball ahead of us that we can say, this is going to happen, and then we can put probabilities aside to it and then model basically what's going to happen in the future. What we can do is to permutate these various agents. That makes it a little bit easier because there are only 5, but it has helped out quite a bit. I said we made a big study on blackouts in terms of energy supply, and we just almost like science fiction said all kinds of combination of these 5s happening. And so we started out, let's say, with a major weather event, and then we had people distrusting the public authorities, all kinds of things happening at the same time, and then we suddenly had created a scenario that nobody had thought about before, because we just looked at the potential connections between these various agents. Now, I'm very clear, nobody of us believes that any of these scenarios will happen exactly the way that we have designed them, but it showed the very vulnerable points in the network. So we could see if those things happen, or if those things happen, or if those things happen. There's always one knot that is extremely vulnerable. So we need to attack that one. And then we have the confidence, it's just a hope, the confidence that if the real scenario, or the real sequence of events happen that we still have, now the system better equipped than it was before.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I had a question relating back to the one before last about the policy makers, because this is so policy relevant, of course. And I wonder about your experience with communicating and having your ideas about things communicated to policymakers, and how does that communication work?
Yes. Yeah, it's partially an uphill battle. I mean, the one thing that we have experienced and still experience is that we go to basic risk management agencies. They are still in their silos. So if I talk to the people, let's say on the pandemic side, they're looking, there are a couple of virologists and epidemiologists and medical people, and they say, oh, the economic things, that's not our business. And the psychology, yes, maybe the clinical psychology we can include, but everything else is excluded. And then it's very difficult to provide a better understanding that, if you don't make trade-offs, if you optimize one dimension, you normally reduce or actually aggravate the impacts on another dimension. In the pandemic, it's very clear. If you just optimize the number of people that are infected, or reduce it to the largest amount, you have major economic impacts, and you have major psychological impacts. You may have major negative impacts on education. So you need to take those things into the same, at the same time count. But our risk management agencies are not prepared to do this, and they also feel that it is a competitive game. If they lose power, if they also think about something else, and the ones that normally think about education don't want to be involved in the virology. And that makes it extremely difficult. And so that's, as I said, an uphill battle to see how can we arrange horizontal cooperation.
Thank you very much. And we from Mittuniversitet University would like to hand you this gift. So congratulations once more.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, also for your good questions.